She was named and will always be referred to as Blackthorn. Today, we bring you 23 Cuttermen for Coast Guard Cutter William Flores, who will place a rose on the memorial for each of our fellow Cuttermen who were lost that day. This is to forever remind us that they should and always will be remembered as the individuals who lost their lives serving as we do today. MKC Ralph Wilson will ring Blackthorn's bell for each crewman who can't muster with us today.
Hey! Hey!
Today's episode is about the United States Coast Guard cutter Blackthorn, which sank after colliding with the freighter SS Capricorn on January 28, 1980. The clip you just heard was recorded on the 35th anniversary of the accident, honoring the 23 Coast Guardsmen who perished in the accident. Stories of loss and grief are never easy to investigate and retell. But in extreme circumstances, we also have examples of bravery and selflessness in the face of danger. The United States Coast Guard cutter Blackthorn, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Blackthorn was laid down on May 21, 1943, at the Marine Iron and Shipbuilding Corporation of Duluth, Minnesota. Her maiden voyage was just 2 months later in July of 1943, and she was commissioned into the United States Coast Guard on March 27, 1944. She was 180 feet in length, had a beam of 37 feet, a draft of 12 feet, and was 935 tons. She was designed to travel at a maximum of 13 knots and had a range of 17,000 miles. The Blackthorn and 39 other 180-foot vessels were built as tenders, also known as buoy tenders, and all but one of these was built in the Duluth shipyard. The Blackthorn initially carried 6 officers and 74 crew, and its job was to service and tend to navigation aids, such as buoys and channel markers. But like many other Coast Guard vessels, she was dispatched to perform many other tasks as needed. For the first few months of her service in 1944, the Blackthorn served as an icebreaker on the Great Lakes before being reassigned to San Pedro, California, as a tender until 1950. The Blackthorn salvaged a naval helicopter in 1948 and assisted 2 distressed aircraft in 1949. In 1950, the Blackthorn was reassigned again, this time to Mobile, Alabama, where she again served as a tender. During her time in Mobile, the Blackthorn was involved in many other search and rescue missions. In April of 1951, she searched for survivors of the SO Greensboro, which had collided with the SO Suez. In 1952, the Blackthorn was involved of the rescue of survivors of a B-17 crash, and in 1953, she assisted with search and rescue operations following the National Airlines Flight 470 crash. Other missions during this time had her salvaging an Air Force plane, searching for missing aircraft, and assisting numerous merchant and military vessels in distress. In 1976, the Blackthorn was again reassigned, this time to Galveston, Texas, where she continued to serve as a tender. In October 1979, the Blackthorn was sent to Tampa, Florida for much-needed repairs and upgrades at the Gulf Tampa Dry Dock Company. In January of 1980, the work on the Blackthorn was completed, and the ship and her crew were ready to return to their base in Galveston. Before leaving Tampa, the Blackthorn was taken out for test runs to check the new upgrades to navigation, radio, propulsion systems, and generator. As the sun was setting on January 28, 1980, the Blackthorn left Tampa with 6 officers and 44 crew on board. Heading outbound, Lieutenant Commander George Seipel was at the con, as he wanted to get a feel for how the vessel was performing following the repairs, before handing the vessel over to Lieutenant David B. Crawford. The Blackthorn was a small ship, especially compared to the large freighters using the port. It was a calm and pleasant night, with clear skies and good visibility during the mild Florida winter. Not long after departing, the Blackthorn approached the tug Pat B., which was hauling a barge in Upper Tampa Bay. Crawford reached the tug via radio and arranged a port-to-port passing. However, the Blackthorn stayed in the middle of the channel rather than veering to the right to allow for more space between the vessels. When they passed, the ships were only 40 feet apart, although neither vessel was negatively impacted. The Soviet passenger liner Kazakhstan was also outbound and quickly approaching the Blackthorn. Pilot Gary Maddox on board the Kazakhstan made 3 attempts to reach the Blackthorn by radio, before finally making contact on the 4th attempt. Maddox requested for the smaller ship to move out of the channel and give way, and the Blackthorn complied, yielding to the larger ship. Once the Kazakhstan passed, the Blackthorn returned to the middle of the channel. Just prior to passing under the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, which spans the mouth of Tampa Bay, Crawford requested to be relieved temporarily, and Lieutenant Commander Sepel granted this request, giving the con to Ensign John Ryan. For those of you who have listened to Episode 3 of this podcast, this is the same Sunshine Skyway Bridge discussed in that episode. This story of the Blackthorn occurred just 4 months prior to the Sunshine Skyway disaster, in virtually the exact location. Ensign Ryan, while trained and certified to be an officer on deck, was on his very first assignment at sea. In fact, none of the deck officers on board the Blackthorn had ever navigated the waters of Tampa Bay prior to this assignment, and 7 of the crew members were on their very first sea voyage. It had even been a little while since Lieutenant Commander Sepel had been at sea. While certainly an experienced officer, it had been almost 5 years since he was last assigned to a seagoing vessel, and only was required to take a rules of the road refresher course. As Ensign Ryan guided the Blackthorn into Cut A, which passes under the bridge, he noticed the front range channel light was extinguished and notified Lieutenant Commander Sepel. Range lights are used to help vessels identify the channel and also distances. Seaman apprentice Mark Gatz was equipped with binoculars and assigned as the lookout on the flying bridge. Lieutenant Commander Sepel considered the anchor detail on the cutter's forecastle to be a secondary lookout, although later testimony proved that nobody assigned to anchor detail considered himself a lookout. After passing under the bridge, Ensign Ryan was visually inspecting the channel and his bearing while using the rear range light to navigate his course. After returning to the bridge from below deck, Lieutenant Crawford asked Ensign Ryan if he had contacted the ship, whose navigation lights had just begun to become visible in the Mullet Key channel, separate from the brightly lit Kazakhstan, which was up ahead. Ryan asked Crawford to contact the ship so he could focus on navigating. The lights in question were of the inbound freighter SS Capricorn. Crawford contacted the Capricorn by radio and received a garbled, unintelligible response, followed by the words, "Coming out of anchorage, won't be in your way." Lieutenant Crawford later testified he was ordered by Lieutenant Commander Sepel to give a Roger response, but Sepel denied giving such an order, and no other witnesses recalled Sepel giving this order. The lookout, Mark Gatz, as well as others on board, noticed the lights, and it appeared to them as if the ship had a very rapid bearing to the left. The crew members stationed on the bow were focused heavily on the Kazakhstan, directly in front, whose bright red, green, blue, and white lights obscured their visibility and prevented them from seeing the lights of the Capricorn. Ensign Ryan, assuming a port-to-port passing had been arranged by Crawford, turned to starboard a bit early from Cut A toward Mullet Key Channel to give extra room between the Blackthorn and the Capricorn. Because he believed the passing was already confirmed by radio, Ryan did not give one short whistle blast indicating his intentions. At this moment, Lieutenant Commander Sepel sighted the Capricorn for the first time, exclaiming, "Where the expletive did he come from?" Sepel later testified that he thought to himself, "That guy is going to run down the buoy on the north side." He went on to say, "That guy just kept turning to port. kept turning, turning. I could see a tremendous bow wake. It was like he was pushing a wall of snow. Sepal heard 5 short whistle blasts, the danger signal, from the Capricorn and immediately ordered right full rudder, taking over the con from Ryan, followed almost immediately by stand by for collision. He then ordered the engines to full astern and braced himself for the collision. At 6:46 p.m., the tanker SS Capricorn weighed anchor and was inbound to the bay carrying 151,600 barrels of oil. The Capricorn was standing, meaning she had right of way in the channel. The Capricorn was 605 feet long, about 3.5 times that of the Blackthorn. She was also 14,126 gross tons, far more than the Blackthorn's 984. She was captained by George P. McShay, Jr., an experienced captain who had been in the waters of Tampa Bay about 15 times previously, including 8 times as captain of the Capricorn. Also on board were 10 additional officers and 23 merchant seamen. At 7:11 p.m., pilot Harry Eugene Knight climbed aboard the Capricorn and assumed the con to guide the ship through the channel and into port. Knight was an experienced pilot, guiding over 1,000 ships through these waters. Just prior to Knight's arrival, Chief Mate John Gordon reported to McShay that the port anchor was ready to be let go, and the starboard side anchor was housed and not ready to be let go. However, this was not communicated to Knight. Captain McShay advised Knight to increase speed to 13.8 knots as it entered Mullet Key Channel, eastbound toward the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. The Capricorn would need to make a 10-degree turn to port to enter Cut A, which passed under the bridge. The Egmont Key Pilot Station had previously informed Knight of 2 piloted vessels the Capricorn would meet during its transit, the tug Ocean Star and the passenger vessel Kazakhstan. The Capricorn met and passed the Ocean Star, which was pushing a loaded barge in Mullet Key Channel. Knight observed the outbound Kazakhstan making its turn from Cut A into Mullet Key Channel at approximately 14 knots. The ship's radar was being monitored by Captain McShay and the chief mate, while an ordinary seaman was serving as lookout on the bow of the ship. But the lookout was not equipped with binoculars and was under orders not to report anything to the bridge unless it was unusual. The lookout did indeed notify the bridge of the Kazakhstan's approach because he estimated the ship to be in the middle of the channel, causing a potentially close port-to-port passage. Pilot Knight was able to contact pilot Gary Maddox on board the Kazakhstan using his VHF radio. Crew members of the nearby tug Pat B and those on board the Blackthorn claimed they overheard this conversation on the radio, saying Maddox informed Knight that a Coast Guard vessel was behind the Kazakhstan and also outbound. However, the 2 pilots later testified that this conversation did not occur until after the collision. The Capricorn and Kazakhstan did pass port to port, albeit at a very close range of 50 feet, and Maddox apologized to Knight over the radio for crowding him. After passing the Kazakhstan, Knight and Captain McShay went to the pilot house and checked the radar. It was at this time Knight noticed the green side light of the approaching Blackthorn, indicating the vessel's starboard side, and it showed on the Capricorn's radar for the first time. The Blackthorn had passed under the bridge and was making its way through Cut A toward Mullet Key Channel. The bow lookout spotted the Blackthorn, but, not finding anything unusual, did not report it to the bridge. Knight then attempted to reach the cutter with the radio, but received no reply. The Capricorn's draft was such that it had to remain in the channel, meaning the water outside the channel would simply be too shallow for the Capricorn. The experienced pilot visually observed the Blackthorn for 30 seconds, getting a read on its bearing, which remained unchanged while he observed. After another failed attempt at contacting the Blackthorn, Knight continued ahead on his planned route and did not change his speed or course. At this time, the Blackthorn was just off the starboard bow of the Capricorn. Regulations dictate port-to-port passing in normal conditions unless the ships can agree otherwise. Not being able to reach the Blackthorn on the radio, Knight had the option of using one short whistle blast to request a port-to-port passing, but he chose not to do so, explaining that he didn't want to limit the options of the other ship. Knight then felt as if the Blackthorn was going to continue straight after leaving Cut A and leave the channel entirely, rather than turning and entering Mullet Key Channel. Captain McShay became concerned about the lack of radio contact between the two vessels. He stepped away from the radar and walked over to Knight and said, "What is this guy trying to prove?" Capricorn was now at the point where it had to begin its turn to enter Cut A, or risk grounding in the shallow waters outside of the channel. Knight determined there was no longer any chance of executing a port-to-port passing with the Blackthorn. He ordered a 10-degree turn to port and sounded 2 short whistle blasts, indicating his intention of a starboard-to-starboard passing. Captain McShay was in agreement with Knight regarding this maneuver. No return whistle blasts were sounded by the Blackthorn, which is standard protocol to acknowledge the message. Instead, the Blackthorn continued on its heading straight through Cut A with no indication of plans to turn. Knight ordered another 20-degree turn to port to put some distance between his ship and the cutter. With still no response from the Blackthorn, Knight ordered hard to port and sounded the danger signal, 5 short whistle blasts. The Capricorn's bow lookout testified to hearing the command "right full rudder" being shouted on the Blackthorn, and Captain McShay saw the Blackthorn had turned hard to starboard, putting her on a collision course with the Capricorn. At 8:21 p.m., the Capricorn collided with the Blackthorn. The collision occurred port bow to port bow, nearly head-on, about 5 to 10 seconds following the Capricorn's whistle blasts. Immediately after the collision, the Capricorn's engines were stopped, and the impact caused the Blackthorn to list 15 degrees to starboard, before settling in at a 5-degree list to port. Neither ship was in danger of immediately sinking, but the momentum of the Capricorn carried her forward, as she grinded and screeched against the Blackthorn. However, the port anchor of the Capricorn, being ready to let go, gouged into the side of the Blackthorn, piercing all the way into the crew shower area and embedding itself into the cutter. Machinery technician Bruce LaFond was found naked and injured by machinery technician Rondal Littoral and Chief Warrant Officer J.S. Miller in the main deck passageway. LaFond was in shock and murmuring about the anchor in the shower. Littoral continued down to the shower area, where he discovered the Capricorn's anchor, fully embedded into the bulkhead. Capricorn's engines were set to full astern, with left rudder. Worried about drifting into the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, Knight guided the ship out of the channel in order to ground her. As the Capricorn drifted, it towed the Blackthorn, stern first, with its anchor fully embedded. The roaring anchor chain continued to let out, overriding the anchor brake. About 20 of the off-duty crew on the Blackthorn gathered on the deck to assess the damage. Some of the inexperienced crew froze in panic. Several of the rookie crewmen had to run to the bulletin board to determine their proper stations. Bosun's mate C.E. Bartell took charge on the mess deck and ordered all portholes closed, damage control equipment retrieved, and also ordered all personnel to general quarters. When the anchor chain of the Capricorn ran out and became taut, it ripped a gaping hole in the Blackthorn, causing her to roll on her port side. After only about 20 seconds, the Blackthorn fully capsized. Lieutenant Commander Seipel gave the order to abandon ship. There was not enough time to pipe the order to the whole ship, or to release any of the lifeboats. Electrician's mate, Larry Clutter, and seaman apprentice William Flores made it to the life jacket locker and began throwing life jackets to men who were already in the water. Most in the water were able to grab one of these life jackets, while others were clinging to the side of the ship. Still more had climbed on top of the now upturned hull. The lookout on the flying bridge of the Blackthorn, seaman apprentice Mark Gatz, had trouble freeing himself from his headset as the ship rolled. He was dragged under, but smartly used a knife to cut himself free and was able to swim to the surface. Seaman M.A. Rhodes was on the mess deck when the ship capsized, with several of his crewmates. Rhodes lifted a 130-pound watertight door over his head and allowed 2 of his shipmates to escape, as the water rushed into the passageway. Rhodes was then able to make his own escape. Before the ship capsized, machinery technician Robert Neisel was securing portholes when he became concerned there could be crewmen trapped below. He selflessly unlocked the watertight door and searched, but found no one. The ship then rolled, trapping him below. He fought his way up the ladder, but was then swept away by a rush of oncoming water. He found himself on the mess deck, where he swam through a watertight door to the buoy deck, and then escaped to the surface. Some of the men rushed to the engine room, believing it was the way out. The flood of water had killed the generators by this time, and all lights had gone out. In the dark, they searched in vain for an escape that simply was not there. Those who made their way out and into the water were holding on to the helpless ship. Chief Warrant Officer Miller organized the men, shouting orders to the men who had crawled on top of the vessel to get into the water, fearing they would be pulled under by the suction of the sinking ship. As the Blackthorn began to submerge, Larry Clutter made his escape to the surface. But Seaman William Flores stayed behind and continued to throw life jackets out to those already in the water. Flores smartly used his own belt to strap the doors to the locker open, so even more life jackets could be released into the water. Flores was only 19 years old and less than a year out of boot camp. He remained behind to provide life jackets to his crewmates, at great risk to his own life. Sadly, William Flores perished in the accident. At 8:22 p.m., a Mayday distress call from the Blackthorn was received at the Group St. Petersburg Coast Guard station. After being asked for the nature of the distress, the Blackthorn responded at 8:23 p.m. with one word: stand by. No further communication from the Blackthorn was received. The Capricorn sent a distress call at 8:24, reporting their collision with another vessel. At 8:25, a nearby shrimp boat named the Bayou reported that the Blackthorn had sunk. A few moments later, the Capricorn reported it was grounded and asked for all available vessels to assist. Within just a few minutes, the Bayou arrived on scene and the men on the shrimp boat began rescuing survivors from the water. In total, the Bayou rescued 23 men and provided them with blankets, food, and warm clothes. The Bayou was manned by William Parker, Vince Dyer, and Charles Whitelaw, whose heroic acts saved the lives of 23 Coast Guardsmen. The St. Petersburg Coast Guard Station dispatched the cutters Vice, White, and Sumac, as well as 5 other craft, to assist with the search and rescue. Chief Warrant Officer Jack J. Roberts was unconscious and in the water, being supported by bosun's mate C.E. Bartell, machinery technician Robert Neisel, electrician's mate Larry Clutter, and Chief Warrant Officer J.S. Miller. Coast Guard vessel 41452, a 41-foot utility boat, arrived at 8:50 p.m., but Miller refused to leave the water until the unconscious Roberts was taken on board. Bartell, who had already been taken on board the Bayou, re-entered the water to assist loading Roberts into the basket to be lifted on board. Bartell boarded the vessel as well, where he issued CPR to Roberts. His efforts, while heroic, were sadly in vain. All survivors were taken by the Bayou and the CG 41452 to nearby Mullet Key, where shore personnel and volunteers provided assistance. Volunteer divers from the Eckerd College Search and Rescue Unit arrived 2 hours after the accident. Strong currents hampered their efforts, and they were not able to enter the interior of the vessel. Their search for survivors revealed no signs of life. The following morning, at 5 a.m., divers from Coastal Diving and Marine Construction arrived on site and made numerous dives to the sunken vessel, recovering 3 bodies in total. Divers from the Pinellas Park Fire Department recovered an additional 2 bodies from the ship's buoy deck. Additional assistance was provided by the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary, numerous local police and fire departments, Florida Marine Patrol, Florida Highway Patrol, and several commercial vessels and private citizens. The Capricorn also launched its lifeboat with 7 men on board to assist, and they searched for survivors for 2 hours. The active Coast Guard search ended 2 days later on January 30th at 4:50 p.m. Over the next several days, bodies continued to be discovered, some as far as 5 miles away from the accident. On February 19th, the Blackthorn was raised and an additional 14 bodies were found inside, 13 of them in the ship's engine room. 27 men survived the accident. 23 Coast Guardsmen lost their lives. The investigation into the accident resulted in problems over jurisdiction. The Coast Guard believed it was theirs, but the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB for short, insisted it belonged to them. Ultimately, both organizations launched independent investigations. The NTSB concluded that the Blackthorn was at fault for the accident, stating the following: "The probable cause of this accident was the failure of the Blackthorn to keep on the proper side of the channel when meeting another vessel in a bend because the commanding officer failed to adequately supervise the actions of an inexperienced officer of the deck. However, responsibility was placed on both Pilot Knight and the commanding officer of the Blackthorn for not establishing a passing arrangement via radio communication." The NTSB also made several damning conclusions related to Lieutenant Commander Siepel and the Coast Guard in general. These included: the CO was not aware of the inbound Capricorn until seconds before the collision, although he was on the Blackthorn's bridge and ultimately in charge of its navigation. The CO's lack of recent seagoing experience and unfamiliarity with Tampa Bay made his decision to sail at night imprudent. The Coast Guard system for selecting officers for assignment as commanding officer and for qualifying officers to take charge of a deck watch is not adequate. The crew of the Blackthorn was not adequately trained in locating life jackets, using life rafts, and water survival techniques. This last finding is supported by testimony from surviving crew members of the Blackthorn. Several of them testified that they had received inadequate water survival training. Others stated they didn't know where the life jackets were stored, and others did not know how to launch the lifeboats. All of the survivors reported trouble using their life jackets. Some had trouble untying the tightly bundled vests in the cold water, while others fumbled with the straps. One survivor placed his head through the armhole in order to stay afloat. While there was not enough time to launch any of the life rafts, the inadequate condition of the life rafts on the Blackthorn is significant to note. 2 of them were over 25 years old and obsolete, and one of those did not have a CO2 cylinder to automatically inflate the raft. Neither of these life rafts would have passed the Coast Guard's own inspection of a civilian ship. A new raft had the word "bad" painted on its storage case and was sliced open. Another was not connected to the mechanism to trigger the auto-inflation. The uninflated raft simply floated away and sank. A 5th life raft had been accidentally inflated while the ship was in dry dock in Tampa and had been secured to the deck. It was never released and went down with the ship. The Coast Guard, in its own investigation, came to similar conclusions as the NTSB, stating, "The Commandant is in agreement with the Marine Board that the proximate cause of casualty was the failure of both vessels to keep well to the side of the channel, which lay on their starboard side. The primary contributing cause was determined to be the failure of the persons in charge of both vessels to ascertain the intentions of the other through the exchange of whistle signals." However, this report indicated many mistakes made by Lieutenant Commander Siepel, including: the commanding officer of the Blackthorn failed to keep apprised of the situation and failed to effectively supervise his inexperienced conning officer, particularly when the ship was departing an unfamiliar port at night. It also placed blame on Pilot Knight for choosing not to sound the one short whistle blast indicating a port-to-port passing, in order to, quote, "leave the options open for the other ship." Many recommendations were cited as well, including more rigorous training of officers, additional life-saving procedure training, and additional inspections of life rafts. In October 1980, the United States federal government recommended criminal charges against Lieutenant Commander George Seipel and newly promoted Lieutenant John Ryan. Rear Admiral Paul A. Yost immediately decided on a non-judicial punishment for Ryan called an Admiral's Mast. If found guilty, he would receive a punishment of anything from a 60-day restriction to base, loss of pay, and a verbal or written reprimand. For Seipel, Admiral Yost consulted with prosecutors and his own legal counsel and decided there was not enough evidence to court-martial him. He reduced his punishment to an Admiral's Mast as well. Seipel received a written admonition on March 18, 1981, just over a year after the accident. This letter, which would go into his permanent record, stated proper care had not been taken with regard to incoming and outgoing ships, and he did not properly supervise his fellow officers and crew. Lieutenant John Ryan received a similar light punishment, and both continued with their Coast Guard careers. Seipel stayed on with the Coast Guard for 8 more years, achieving the rank of commander. He retired in 1988 after serving 21 years in the United States Coast Guard. He currently operates a marine surveying company with his son in Alaska. Lieutenant John Ryan remained in the Coast Guard, reaching the rank of lieutenant commander before retiring. Pilot Harry Eugene Knight continued operating as pilot in Tampa Bay for many years without incident. Captain George McShay went on to become a pilot for the Long Beach Pilot Association in California. The Blackthorn tragedy resulted in the Coast Guard's creation of the Command and Operations School in 1986. Every Coast Guard officer who is responsible for the navigation of a ship is required to attend for 2 weeks. In its mission, the school states, the sinking of the cutters Cuyahoga and Blackthorn highlighted the need for a course that refreshed the collision avoidance and damage control skills of the senior leadership aboard cutters prior to assuming their duties. The Blackthorn was raised a few weeks after the accident, and it was deemed to be unsalvageable. The cutter was taken 20 miles offshore in the Gulf of Mexico and sunk as part of an artificial reef program. The Capricorn sustained minor damage and was sent to a dry dock in Jacksonville, Florida for repairs. Its fate remains largely a mystery, and records of it completely disappear from 1981 to 1984 when it was sold to a Taiwanese company. It is largely believed the ship was dismantled for scrap during the tough economic times of the 1980s oil embargo. The heroic actions of William R. Flores somehow were overlooked for 20 years, despite others receiving recognition by the Coast Guard. Survivors of the Blackthorn, especially electrician's mate Larry Clutter, helped bring his actions to light, and in 2000, Flores was posthumously awarded the Coast Guard Medal, the service's highest medal awarded for bravery. In November 2011, the Coast Guard named its third Sentinel-class cutter the United States Coast Guard cutter William Flores. His actions are well known throughout the Coast Guard to this day, and he is revered as the epitome of bravery. In January of 2020, a life-size concrete statue of Flores was unveiled at a ceremony in St. Petersburg, honoring the 40th anniversary of the Blackthorn disaster. The statue was placed 10 miles offshore from Clearwater, Florida, as part of an underwater monument called the Circle of Heroes, under 40 feet of water. The statue of William Flores was the 13th to be added to the monument. Retired Lieutenant Commander John Ryan, who was at the helm of the Blackthorn that night, said of Flores, "That quiet young man that I was impressed with from the first time I met him will forever be a hero in my eyes. I have never forgotten him, and never will. It is a fitting tribute to his heroism that a cutter will bear his name." Other survivors were also recognized and received commendations from the Coast Guard. Electrician's mate Larry Clutter, bosun's mate C.E. Bartell, Hospital Corpsman R.L. Chamness, Chief Warrant Officer J.S. Miller, Seaman Apprentice M.D. Gray, and Seaman Apprentice M.A. Rhodes. A 6,000-pound granite monument commemorating the Blackthorn was dedicated in 1981. Located at the northern approach to the Sunshine Skyway Bridge in St. Petersburg, it points out to the location where the Blackthorn and Capricorn collided. All 23 Coast Guardsmen who lost their lives are listed on the 5-foot-wide by 8-foot-tall monument. Retired Coast Guard Chief Petty Officer John Chassereau led fundraising efforts to build the memorial and served as the Blackthorn Memorial Committee chairman for 25 years. Some final thoughts about the Blackthorn. In the telling of so many tragic stories, I do my best to provide a factual retelling of the events, without editorializing. But it is sometimes difficult to rehash these moments. I have tremendous respect for members of the armed forces and merchant mariners, and I am aware of the risks they routinely must take. But we are all imperfect. We can be complacent, forgetful, overconfident, and boastful, oftentimes to our detriment. What happened that night was not the result of bad intentions. As human beings, we can get lost in our heads and go into autopilot mode. The actions of some, like William Flores, remind me that we are also capable of tremendous feats of bravery and selflessness. I hope you have enjoyed this episode about the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Blackthorn. As always, I am grateful to you, my listeners. If you haven't already, please follow the podcast on social media at ShipwrecksPod. That's on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And now even on Mastodon at ShipwrecksPod at C, that's the letter C, .im. And please don't forget to take just a quick moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to the show. You can also leave a review on goodpods.com or podchaser.com. Thank you so much. Big thank you to the Communications Director for the Master Chief Petty Officer of the United States Coast Guard, Crystal Lynn Canine, for the audio of the memorial ceremony at the top of this episode. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. Our outstanding original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can follow him on YouTube at Sean Secret. Thank you so much for listening, and please remember to wear your life jackets.